One kiss, that's all it took. After watching Diphtheria steal her youngest daughter, she broke her one rule. Seeing her son finally recovering, she leaned in to comfort him. A single kiss that sealed her own fate. Within weeks, she too would be dead at 35, a mother consumed by the very plague that shattered her family. But her personal tragedy would become the world's, leaving behind a poisoned bloodline that would haunt the thrones of Europe for generations. This was Princess Alice, the tragic daughter of Queen Victoria. To truly understand Alice, we have to transport ourselves back to the 19th century, to Victorian Britain. And let me tell you, this was not the stuffy monochrome world we often imagine from old photographs. It was an era of explosive change, a whirlwind of contradictions. This was the age of steam and steel, of sprawling factories belching smoke into the sky, creating unimaginable wealth for some and grinding poverty for others. It was the age of Darwin, of new ideas that were shaking the very foundations of faith and society. And at the epicenter of it all was the British Empire, a global superpower upon which the sun, quite literally, never set. Presiding over this vast, complex world was a young queen, Victoria, and her brilliant, beloved husband, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Together, they were determined to reinvent the monarchy. They envisioned a royal family that was not decadent and distant like their Hanoverian predecessors, but one that was a moral compass for the nation, respectable, dutiful, and domestic. Their family life was to be a model for every family in the empire. Into this meticulously crafted environment, on April 25, 1843, Princess Alice Maud Mary was born at Buckingham Palace. She was the third child and second daughter, arriving after Victoria, the Princess Royal, known as Vicky, and Albert Edward, the heir apparent, known as Bertie. In a family that would eventually swell to 9 children, Alice's position was significant. She wasn't the brilliant, precocious firstborn like Vicky, who was her father's intellectual favorite and destined for a grand German throne. Nor was she the all-important male heir like Bertie, whose every move was scrutinized and whose rebellious streak caused his parents endless anxiety. Alice was different. From a very early age, she exhibited a quality that was perhaps less valued in the high-stakes world of royal matchmaking, but would come to define her entire existence, a deep instinctual empathy. She was the family's little peacemaker, the sensitive soul. Anecdotes from the royal nursery abound. While other children might be squabbling over toys, little Alice would be found tending to a sick pet or comforting a younger sibling who had taken a tumble. She was gentle, sweet-natured, and possessed a quiet charm that drew people to her. The royal children's upbringing, masterminded by Prince Albert, was a rigorous affair, known as the Coburg method. It was a stark departure from the neglectful royal parenting of the past. Their days were structured with military precision, lessons in languages, history, science, and mathematics, alongside accomplishments like music, drawing, and dancing. They had model farms to learn about agriculture and workshops where they learned practical skills. Albert's goal was to create a new breed of royalty, informed, conscientious, and ready for the challenges of the modern world. Within this structured world, Alice found her niche. She adored her father, and the feeling was mutual. While Vicky was his intellectual sparring partner, Alice was his artistic confidant. He nurtured her talent for drawing and sculpture, and shared with her his passion for music, particularly the works of Wagner. He saw in her a kindred spirit, one who felt things deeply. He nicknamed her "our little angel" and the angel in the house. It was from Albert that she absorbed a powerful sense of noblesse oblige, the conviction that their immense privilege came with an equally immense responsibility to serve those less fortunate. This was not a theoretical concept for Albert, and through him it became a core tenet of Alice's being. The dynamic among the siblings was a miniature version of any large family, amplified by their unique circumstances. Vicky was the dazzling star, Bertie the charming rogue. There was Alfred, the sailor prince, Helena, the steady and reliable one, Louise, the rebellious artist, Arthur, the soldier, the frail and intellectual Leopold, whose mysterious illness cast a constant shadow, and finally, Beatrice, the baby of the family. Alice navigated these complex currents with a quiet grace. She was particularly close to her older brother Bertie, often acting as a mediator between him and their demanding parents. She understood his frustrations in a way few others did, offering a sympathetic ear that the future king desperately needed. This idyllic, if demanding childhood was lived within the gilded cages of Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and their beloved private retreat, Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. Here, Albert designed a Swiss cottage for the children, a miniature world where they could play at being adults, cooking in their own kitchen, and tending their own gardens. It was an attempt to give them a taste of normal life, but of course their lives were anything but normal. Every lesson, every outing, every interaction was freighted with the weight of their destiny. They were not just children, they were living symbols of the monarchy, pieces on the grand chessboard of European politics. Alice grew up understanding that her future, particularly her marriage, would not be her own to decide. It would be a matter of statecraft, a strategic alliance to strengthen Britain's position on the continent. Yet even as she prepared for this predetermined future, the compassionate, artistic girl with a heart full of feeling was quietly forging her own path, one that would lead her far from the polished floors of the ballroom and into the messy, complicated, and often painful reality of the human condition. As Alice blossomed from a sensitive child into a young woman, the machinery of royal life began to turn in earnest. A princess's adolescence in the 19th century was essentially a prelude to her primary function, marriage. The search for a suitable husband was not a romantic quest, it was a complex diplomatic exercise. The criteria were strict. He had to be of royal blood, Protestant, and from a house that would be a politically advantageous match for Britain. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert surveyed the landscape of European princes with meticulous care. Several candidates were considered and dismissed. For Alice, who possessed a quiet beauty and a gentle demeanor, they wanted someone of solid character, a man who would appreciate her unique qualities. The choice eventually fell upon a German prince, Louis of Hesse, and by Rhine. Prince Louis was handsome, earnest, and well-regarded, but his station was relatively modest. The Grand Duchy of Hesse was a small, unassuming German state, not a major European power like Prussia or Austria. Some in the British court whispered that it was a rather lackluster match for a daughter of Queen Victoria. But Victoria and Albert saw something more important than a grand title or vast lands. They saw in Louis a kind, steady, and honorable man. They believed he would make their sensitive Alice happy, and for them, that was paramount. Alice and Louis met for the first time in 1860 at Windsor. The attraction was not a thunderclap of passion, but a gentle mutual affection that quickly deepened. Louis was charmed by Alice's warmth and intelligence, and Alice was drawn to his straightforward, unpretentious nature. She wrote in her journal of his unaffected and natural manner. In a world of suffocating formality, his sincerity was a breath of fresh air. Prince Albert was particularly pleased with the match, seeing in Louis a young man he could mentor. The engagement was announced in November 1860, and Alice's future seemed bright and secure. A life of domestic happiness as the consort of a minor but respected German ruler awaited her. But fate, as it so often does, had a cruel and devastating twist in store. The year 1861, which should have been a time of joyful wedding preparations, descended into a nightmare that would permanently scar the royal family and catapult the 18-year-old Alice into a role of unimaginable responsibility. It began with a series of smaller sorrows. In March, Queen Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, passed away. The Queen was prostrated by grief, and it was Alice who stepped into the breach, nursing her grandmother in her final days and then becoming the primary source of comfort for her devastated mother. This was the first time she was called upon to be the family's emotional bedrock, a role she would tragically reprise. Then in the autumn came the true catastrophe. Prince Albert, the pillar of the family, the brilliant mind behind Victoria's throne, the adored father, fell ill. At first it was dismissed as a bad cold or influenza, but he did not recover. His strength waned, and the doctors at Windsor Castle became increasingly concerned. The diagnosis was eventually confirmed: typhoid fever, a disease that was often a death sentence in the 19th century. The atmosphere in the castle became thick with a creeping dread. Queen Victoria, who adored her husband with a singular, all-consuming passion, refused to accept the severity of the situation. She was in a state of frantic denial, unable to comprehend a world without him. The royal household was paralyzed by her grief and fear. And in the midst of this chaos, it was Princess Alice who emerged as a beacon of calm and strength. Putting her own fear and sorrow aside, she took charge. She became her father's principal nurse. For weeks, she barely left his bedside. While professional doctors and nurses were present, it was Alice who provided the intimate personal care. She read to him from his favorite books, played the piano to soothe him, fed him his meals, and sat with him through the long, dark nights, holding his hand and whispering words of comfort. She became the sole intermediary between the sick room and the outside world, relaying the doctor's grim reports to her mother and trying to manage the Queen's spiraling despair. Imagine the pressure on this young woman. She was not yet 19. Her own heart was breaking as she watched her beloved father fade away. Yet, she had to remain composed. She had to be the strong one for her mother, for her siblings, for the entire household. Eyewitness accounts from the time are filled with awe at her fortitude. She was, as one courtier wrote, an angel of mercy. The final tragic scene unfolded on the cold, damp night of December 14th, 1861. The entire family was gathered around Prince Albert's deathbed in the Blue Room at Windsor. As the clock ticked towards midnight, Albert breathed his last. Queen Victoria let out a cry of pure anguish that was said to have echoed through the silent castle. Her world had ended. And in that moment, as her mother collapsed in her arms, Alice's childhood ended too. The aftermath was a landscape of profound and unrelenting grief. Queen Victoria plunged into a state of deep, pathological mourning that would last for the rest of her life. She became the widow of Windsor, a remote figure shrouded in black, who retreated almost entirely from public life. The vibrant, active court of Victoria and Albert was gone, replaced by a silent, gloomy world dictated by the rituals of bereavement. And who was left to pick up the pieces? Alice. With her own wedding just months away, she had to postpone her personal life and put her own grief on hold. She became her mother's rock, her dear, good Alice. She took over much of her father's role as the Queen's unofficial private secretary, organizing state papers, drafting letters, and acting as the primary channel of communication between the grieving monarch and her government ministers. She would spend hours each day with Victoria, reading to her, walking with her, and simply enduring her overwhelming, often suffocating sorrow. This period forged Alice's character in a crucible of loss. It solidified her identity as a caregiver, a role she had always naturally gravitated towards, but which was now demanded of her on a monumental scale. It taught her resilience, strength, and an intimate first-hand understanding of human suffering. But it also came at a terrible cost. The vivacious, artistic girl was now a woman burdened by the grief of a nation and the inconsolable sorrow of its queen. The shadow of her father's death would stretch over the rest of her life, influencing every decision she made and setting the stage for a future where duty and tragedy would be forever intertwined. The death of Prince Albert left a wound in the heart of the British monarchy that would never truly heal. For his daughter Alice, it was a personal apocalypse that transformed her overnight from a protected princess into the stoic guardian of her mother's grief. But life, particularly royal life, must go on. Her engagement to Prince Louis of Hesse was a settled matter, a final piece of her beloved father's grand design for his children, and not even the Queen's profound mourning could prevent it from proceeding. What should have been the grandest, most celebrated royal wedding of the season became one of the most somber and poignant ceremonies in British history. On the 1st of July, 1862, in the dining room at Osborne House, chosen for its privacy over the grand chapels of Windsor or London, Alice and Louis were married. The scene was surreal. Queen Victoria, a solitary figure consumed by sorrow, sat apart from the main gathering, shielded by a portrait of her late husband. She was dressed from head to toe in the deep black weeds of widowhood, a living monument to her loss. She wrote in her journal that the day was more of a funeral than a wedding. The bride herself could not escape the gloom. Alice walked down the aisle, a vision in white silk and Honiton lace, but even her wedding dress was touched by mourning. The customary orange blossoms were interspersed with sprigs of myrtle, a German tradition, but the overall atmosphere was heavy and oppressive. The small gathering of family members spoke in hushed tones. The joy was muted, strained, as if no one dared to be too happy in the presence of the Queen's monumental grief. It was a wedding held in the shadow of a mausoleum, and for Alice, it was a symbolic beginning to a marriage that would forever be linked to duty and loss. Her departure from England was a wrenching affair. She was leaving behind not just her home and siblings, but a mother who was emotionally dependent on her in a way that was both profound and draining. Victoria clung to her, weeping, making the farewells almost unbearable. For Alice, it must have felt like an impossible choice. Stepping into her own future meant abandoning the mother who seemed to need her for her very survival. Her arrival in the Grand Duchy of Hesse was, in many ways, a shock to the system. After the opulence and political might of the British court, Darmstadt felt small, provincial, and deeply traditional. The new palace in Darmstadt was old and drafty, lacking the modern comforts and grandeur of Windsor or Buckingham Palace. The Hessian court was stiff, formal, and far more conservative than what she was used to. Her attempts to introduce the more relaxed, family-oriented customs of her English upbringing, like having her ladies-in-waiting dine with her, were met with quiet disapproval and resistance. Her relationship with her new husband, Louis, was one of genuine affection, but it was not without its challenges. Louis was a kind and dutiful soldier, but he was not an intellectual. He did not share Alice's passion for art, music, or social philosophy. Her intellectually curious mind, so carefully nurtured by Prince Albert, found little stimulation in the endless cycle of military reviews and stilted court functions that made up her husband's world. There was a loneliness to her new position. She was the Grand Duchess in waiting, a foreign princess in a land that was not yet her own, married to a man she loved, but who could not fully comprehend the depths of her mind or the scale of her ambitions. The gilded cage had simply been replaced by another, albeit a slightly less glamorous one. A lesser woman might have resigned herself to this life of quiet frustration, filling her days with embroidery and polite conversation. But Alice was her father's daughter. The concept of a life without purpose was anathema to her. She had been raised to believe that her position conferred upon her a sacred duty to do good, and if the rigid confines of the Darmstadt court would not provide her with an outlet, she would create one for herself. She began to channel her formidable energy and intelligence into social reform, a field that was almost entirely unheard of for a woman of her rank. Her first and most enduring passion was nursing. This was not a passing fad. She had seen suffering and death up close in her own family, and it had ignited in her a fierce desire to alleviate the pain of others. She began an extraordinary correspondence with the one woman in Europe who knew more about nursing than anyone else, Florence Nightingale. Imagine that. A princess of Great Britain writing letters from her German palace, not about fashion or court gossip, but about hospital sanitation, the proper training of nurses, and the design of surgical wards. She devoured Nightingale's books and reports, and with Nightingale as her long-distance mentor, Alice began to revolutionize the primitive healthcare system in Hesse. She was not content to simply be a patron, to lend her name to a hospital and attend the opening ceremony. She got involved deeply. She founded a series of organizations, most notably the Alice Verein für Krankenpflege, the Alice Association for Nursing, and the Alice Verein für Frauenbildung und Erwerb, the Alice Society for Women's Education and Employment. These were not just charities, they were groundbreaking institutions. Her goal was twofold: to improve the quality of care for the sick and poor, and to provide respectable professional employment for women, a concept that was radical in an era when a woman's place was strictly in the home. She personally oversaw the curriculum for her training nurses, insisting on high standards of hygiene, medical knowledge, and compassionate care. She didn't just direct from afar, she made constant, unannounced visits to the hospitals and clinics she supported. The starched matrons and stuffy court officials were often horrified to find the future Grand Duchess in the kitchens, checking the quality of the soup, or in the laundry, ensuring the linens were properly boiled. She would sit for hours by the bedsides of destitute patients, talking to them, learning their stories, and offering them a level of personal comfort they had never known. She saw them not as subjects or charity cases, but as fellow human beings deserving of dignity. In a world defined by rigid class structures, this was a revolutionary act of empathy. She was building a new model of royalty, one based not on divine right, but on compassionate service. This work gave her the purpose she craved, but it also set her apart. Some at the Hessian court viewed her activities with suspicion. Why was this English princess so concerned with the grubby details of drains and bandages? Why wasn't she content to simply produce heirs and attend balls? They misunderstood her drive, seeing it as an eccentric English hobby rather than the defining mission of her life. But Alice, fortified by her father's teachings and her own deep convictions, pressed on, slowly but surely, transforming her adopted country for the better. In the summer of 1866, the political tensions that had been simmering in Central Europe for years finally boiled over. The Austro-Prussian War, the so-called 7 Weeks' War, erupted, a brutal power struggle for dominance over the German states. This conflict thrust Alice into an agonizingly difficult position. Her adopted country, Hesse, sided with Austria. Her beloved older sister Vicky was the crown princess of Prussia, the enemy. The war pitted brother-in-law against brother-in-law and sister against sister. Her husband Louis immediately left for the front to command the Hessian troops. Suddenly Alice, just 23 years old and pregnant with her third child, was left in charge of a country at war. The quiet provincial life of Darmstadt was shattered. The harsh realities of conflict were now at her doorstep, and she met the challenge with a level of courage and organizational genius that stunned everyone. She put aside her personal anxieties and transformed herself into a veritable commander-in-chief of medical services. Her philanthropic organizations, the Alice Societies, became the backbone of the war effort on the home front. She organized committees of women who worked day and night, scraping lint for bandages, gathering food and medical supplies, and preparing comfort packages for the soldiers. Her own palace was turned into a depot for these supplies, but her most extraordinary work was done in the military hospitals, the lazarettos that were hastily set up to receive the tide of wounded men pouring back from the battlefield. This was not the clean, ordered world of the civilian hospitals she had worked to reform. This was the brutal, bloody reality of war. The wards were filled with men suffering from horrific injuries, mangled limbs, gunshot wounds, and rampant infections like gangrene and dysentery. The stench of blood and disease was overwhelming. And in the middle of this hellish scene was Princess Alice. She refused to remain in the safety of her palace. Every day she would go to the hospitals, her fine dresses covered by a simple apron, and she would work. She didn't just make brief, formal inspections. She rolled up her sleeves and nursed the men herself. She cleaned wounds, changed foul dressings, fed those who could not feed themselves, and sat with the dying, offering a final moment of human connection. There are incredible accounts from this period. One story tells of her assisting a surgeon during a difficult amputation, calming the terrified soldier as the procedure was performed without adequate anesthesia. Another describes her finding a young soldier in agony from a stomach wound, taking it upon herself to spoon-feed him broth, drop by drop, for over an hour, until he finally passed away peacefully. She made no distinction between Hessian and Prussian soldiers. A wounded man was a wounded man, and she treated them all with the same boundless compassion. She became a legend, a beacon of hope in a time of darkness, known throughout the duchy as the Angel of Darmstadt. This work took a tremendous physical and emotional toll. She was witnessing the very worst of humanity, yet she never faltered. The experience solidified her belief in the importance of professional nursing and cemented her reputation as a woman of action and immense bravery. Hesse and its Austrian allies were swiftly defeated by the technologically superior Prussian army. The war was a humiliation. Part of the Grand Duchy was annexed by Prussia, and a heavy indemnity was imposed. Louis returned from the front a defeated commander. It was a dark time for her adopted country, and Alice once again found herself in the role of mediator. Using her close connection to her sister Vicky, the future Empress of Germany, she advocated tirelessly for Hesse, working behind the scenes to soften the harsh terms imposed by the victorious Prussians. She had proven herself not just as a nurse, but as a shrewd and capable political operator. Amidst the turmoil of war and the demands of her public work, Alice's private world was expanding. She was, above all else, a devoted mother. Her approach to child rearing was as hands-on and progressive as her approach to philanthropy. She rejected the distant, formal style of parenting common among the aristocracy, where children were raised almost exclusively by nannies and governesses. She wanted to be personally involved in every aspect of her children's lives. Her first child, Victoria, was born in 1863, followed by Elizabeth, known as Ella, in 1864. Then came Irene in 1866, born in the midst of the war. Her first son and heir, Ernst Ludwig, arrived in 1868. Alice was an intensely maternal figure. She made the shocking decision to breastfeed her own babies, something virtually unheard of in royal circles, and which drew considerable criticism from both the German court and even her own mother, Queen Victoria, who considered it an animalistic, unladylike practice. But Alice was adamant. She believed in the importance of a close physical bond between mother and child. She designed her children's clothes, supervised their lessons, and filled their lives with the warmth and affection that had sometimes been lacking in her own regimented upbringing. She wanted them to grow up to be compassionate, unpretentious, and aware of the world beyond the palace walls. She would take them with her on visits to hospitals and orphanages, instilling in them from a young age the same sense of duty and empathy that her father had instilled in her. Yet, even in the joy of her growing family, a shadow was beginning to gather, a storm cloud on the horizon that was at this point invisible to all. A hidden legacy, passed down from her mother, Queen Victoria, was silently making its way through the generations. The royal disease, hemophilia, a genetic disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly, was a terrifying and little understood condition. Alice, like several of her siblings, was a carrier of the gene, though she herself was unaffected. The first real sign of the impending tragedy came in 1870, with the birth of her second son, Prince Friedrich, whom the family affectionately called Fritty. He was a bright, happy baby, but as he began to crawl and toddle, small bumps and bruises would result in alarming, prolonged bleeding and painful swelling. The doctors were puzzled. While the family was aware of the condition in their uncle, Prince Leopold, the full, terrifying implications of this genetic inheritance were not yet understood. For now it was a source of private worry, a strange fragility in her beautiful little boy that kept Alice in a state of constant low-level anxiety. All the while, she maintained her role as Queen Victoria's long-distance confidant. An almost daily stream of letters flowed between Darmstadt and Windsor. Victoria's letters were often filled with complaints about her loneliness, her health, and her dissatisfaction with her other children. She relied on Alice for emotional support, yet she could also be intensely critical, questioning Alice's parenting choices, her liberal theological views, and her hands-on approach to charity. Alice's replies are a masterclass in diplomacy and filial duty. They are filled with affection and concern for her mother, but one can read between the lines and sense the strain of a daughter constantly trying to live up to the expectations of a demanding and grief-stricken parent, all while managing her own growing family, her public duties, and the creeping unspoken fear for her son's health. A storm was coming, one that would test her legendary compassion and strength to their absolute limits. After the crucible of the Austro-Prussian War, Alice had emerged as a figure of immense moral authority. She was no longer just the English princess. She was the beloved Angel of Darmstadt, a woman whose compassion had been tested by fire and found to be unbreakable. The following years brought a period of relative peace to Europe, a time for nations to bind their wounds and for Alice to focus on her growing family and her ambitious social projects. But the continent's respite was short-lived. By 1870, the political chess match between an ambitious Prussia and an anxious French Empire under Napoleon III reached its breaking point. The Franco-Prussian War erupted, and once again, Germany was ablaze. This time, however, the political landscape had shifted. Hesse fought alongside Prussia as part of the North German Confederation. Her husband Louis was again called to the front, but now as a commander within a powerful unified German military machine that would march to a swift and decisive victory. For Alice, the familiar grim routine began anew. The organizational structures she had built 4 years earlier were reactivated, now operating with even greater efficiency. Once more, the palaces became hospitals and supply depots. Once more, she marshaled her army of women to roll bandages and prepare medicines. And once more, she walked the wards, her calm presence a balm to the terrified and broken men who filled them. Her compassion remained, as always, boundless. She made it explicitly clear that every wounded soldier, regardless of their uniform, was to receive the same level of care. There is a moving account of her spending an entire afternoon with a young, dying French soldier, a boy far from his home and his family. He was delirious with fever and crying out for his mother. Alice, a mother herself, sat by his side, bathed his forehead with a cool cloth, and spoke to him in gentle French, soothing him until the end came. For her, in the face of suffering, nationality was meaningless. There were no enemies, only sons, husbands, and brothers in need of comfort. The war ended in a stunning victory for the German states and led to the moment Prince Albert had long dreamed of, the unification of Germany under a single emperor, King Wilhelm I of Prussia. This seismic shift in European power had personal consequences for Alice. Her sister Vicky was now crown princess of a new and mighty German empire. Her husband Louis was a respected commander in its victorious army. The family's status was elevated, but for Alice, the triumph was tempered by the human cost she had witnessed firsthand. Life continued, and her own family grew. In 1872, she gave birth to her 6th child, a daughter named Alex, the future Alexandra Feodorovna of Russia. 2 years later, in 1874, her 7th and final child, another daughter named Marie, or May, was born. The family was now complete. Their home at Kranichstein was a lively, happy place, filled with the sounds of children's laughter. To an outside observer, Princess Alice seemed to have it all: a loving husband, a beautiful family, and a meaningful life of public service. But she was living on borrowed time. The genetic time bomb was ticking, and fate was about to deliver its first devastating blow. May the 29th, 1873 began as an ordinary day. The sun was shining and the children were playing. Alice was in a room with her youngest son, the bright and cheerful 2.5-year-old Friddy. Her older son Ernst, who was 4, was playing in an adjacent room. In a sudden burst of boyish energy, Ernst ran from his room into his mother's, making a game of dashing towards a large open window. What happened next took only a few seconds, the kind of horrifying, mundane accident that is every parent's worst nightmare. Alice, reacting instantly, rushed across the room to grab Ernst and pull him away from the danger of the window. For a fleeting moment, her back was turned. In that single instant, little Friddy, mimicking his older brother, toddled over to a chair that had been left near the window, clambered up onto it, and tumbled out. He fell 20 feet onto the stone terrace below. The scream that must have torn from Alice's throat is unimaginable. She ran down, finding her son conscious, but dazed. There were no obvious catastrophic injuries, just a cut on his head. For a brief, hopeful moment, it seemed he might be all right. But Alice, who knew of his strange fragility, his tendency to bleed and bruise so alarmingly, must have felt a cold dread gripping her heart. They rushed the little boy to his bed. The doctors were called, but there was nothing they could do. Friddy's hemophilia, the hidden enemy within his blood, had turned a survivable fall into a death sentence. He began to bleed internally. As the hours passed, he grew weaker, his small body unable to fight the hemorrhaging that no one could see and no one could stop. That afternoon, he died in his mother's arms. The grief that descended upon Alice was absolute. It was a physical and spiritual agony that shattered her. This was not the dignified, dutiful sorrow she had felt for her father. This was the raw, primal, unnatural grief of a mother who has lost her child. It was a wound from which she would never, ever recover. Her letters to Queen Victoria from this period are almost unbearable to read. "The horror of my darling's death is still before me, and will ever be," she wrote. "My heart is bleeding." And later, "The world is a desert to me now. My darling's little voice I shall never hear again." She was consumed by guilt, replaying those few fatal seconds in her mind 1,000 times over. She felt that she had failed to protect her son. Her deep religious faith, which had sustained her through so much, was shaken to its core. How could a loving God allow such a thing to happen? The tragedy cast a permanent pall over the family. The other children were confused and frightened. Young Ernst, who had witnessed the event, was particularly traumatized, plagued by nightmares and a deep sense of guilt that he was somehow responsible. Alice's own health suffered. She became thin and pale, a ghost of her former self. The light in her eyes, so often praised for its warmth and compassion, seemed to dim. The death of Friddy did more than just break her heart. It confirmed the terrifying reality of what she had long feared. The family curse, as she began to call it, was real. It was not just a strange affliction of her brother Leopold. It was a poison she carried within herself, a threat that could be passed to her children. From that day forward, a new and terrible fear became her constant companion. The fear that this tragedy could happen again, that the other children, particularly her surviving son, might also be afflicted. Every scraped knee, every small cut, became a source of panic. The joyful, hands-on mother was now also a guardian against a hidden internal enemy she could not see or fight. She found what little solace she could in her work, pouring her own pain into her efforts to ease the pain of others. But the joy was gone, replaced by a quiet, heartbreaking resignation. In the years following Friddy's death, Alice seemed to age beyond her years. The weight of her sorrow was a physical burden, visible in the lines on her face and the sadness that never quite left her eyes. She continued her public work with the same unwavering dedication, finding in service a purpose that helped keep the darkness at bay. She became more introspective, seeking answers in philosophy and corresponding with controversial theologians like David Strauss, which earned her the disapproval of the more orthodox members of her family, including her mother. She was a woman searching for meaning in a world that had become, for her, a place of profound and senseless pain. In June of 1877, another significant change came to her life. Her husband's uncle, the reigning Grand Duke Louis III, died without issue. Her husband Louis became Grand Duke Louis IV, and Alice, at the age of 34, became the Grand Duchess of Hesse and by Rhine. It was a role she had been preparing for her entire adult life, but one she now assumed with a heavy heart. The new position brought with it a host of new responsibilities, many of which she found intensely tedious. The endless official receptions, the stiff court ceremonies, the need to entertain visiting dignitaries. It all felt like a hollow pantomime to a woman who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death. She wrote to her mother of her weariness, of her longing for a simpler, private life away from the public gaze. Nevertheless, she performed her duties with her customary grace and diligence. She saw her new authority primarily as a tool, a way to expand her philanthropic projects and push for the social reforms she believed in so passionately. She championed education for women and continued to be a fierce advocate for public health, using her elevated platform to effect real change. Her children were her one true source of joy. Victoria, the eldest, was a serious and intelligent young woman, already her mother's confidant. Ella was blossoming into a striking beauty, renowned throughout the courts of Europe. Irene was the gentle, unassuming one. Ernst, still a sensitive and emotional boy, was slowly healing from the trauma of his brother's death. And then there were the two youngest, Alex and Marie, known as Sunny and May. They were the light of the family, inseparable playmates, who brought a much-needed sense of sunshine back into the palace. Alice's love for them was fierce and protective, a mother bear guarding her cubs against a world she now knew to be full of hidden dangers. This fragile peace, this delicate balance of public duty and private solace, was about to be obliterated. In the autumn of 1878, a specter far more terrifying than war swept through Darmstadt. It was an enemy that did not carry a rifle or a sword, an invisible killer that could invade the wealthiest palace as easily as the poorest hovel. It was diphtheria. The outbreak began, as it so often does, with a single sick child. In early November 1878, Alice's eldest daughter, Victoria, complained of a stiff neck and a sore throat. Within days, she was diagnosed with diphtheria, the terrifying, choking angel of the 19th century, a bacterial infection that caused a thick gray membrane to grow in the throat, literally suffocating its victims. The disease spread through the palace with horrifying speed. Soon, 6-year-old Alex fell ill, then 7-year-old Irene, then 10-year-old Ernst, and finally the baby of the family, 4-year-old May. The only children to be spared were Ella, who was quickly sent away to stay with her paternal grandmother, and Alice herself. The new palace was transformed into a quarantine ward, a house of fear and sickness. Louis, distraught, could do little but offer support. The nursing fell to Alice. Once again she became the heroic nurse. But this was not a distant hospital ward filled with anonymous soldiers. These were her own children, her precious babies, fighting for their lives. Drawing on all her years of experience, she established a strict medical regimen. She hung sheets soaked in disinfectant, maintained a constant flow of steam in the sick rooms to ease their breathing, and personally administered the foul-tasting medicines. She was tireless, moving from bed to bed, a constant presence day and night. She barely slept, sustained only by a mother's desperate will to save her children. The doctors who attended the family were in awe of her knowledge and her composure, crediting her meticulous care with keeping the children alive. For a time, it seemed her efforts might be enough, but the disease was relentless. The youngest child, little May, had the weakest constitution. Her condition worsened dramatically. On the morning of November 16th, the little girl choked to death in her mother's arms. Alice's heart, already so bruised, was utterly broken. But she had no time to grieve. Her other children were still desperately ill, and their survival depended on their spirits remaining high. She made the almost superhuman decision to conceal May's death from them. She had the little body removed from the palace secretly and told the others that May had been sent away to her grandmother's to recover. For weeks she carried this terrible secret alone, putting on a brave face for her children, talking about what presents they would buy for May when she returned, all while her own soul was screaming in agony. Slowly, miraculously, the other children began to recover. The crisis seemed to have passed. The last to get better was Ernst, her only surviving son. The long illness had left him weak and deeply depressed. He missed his little sister May terribly and cried for her constantly. One afternoon, as he sat sobbing, Alice tried to comfort him with words, but he was inconsolable. In that moment, a mother's heart overruled a nurse's training. Overwhelmed by love and relief that he was alive, she broke her own rigid quarantine rules. She leaned in, pulled her grieving son into a tight embrace, and gave him a kiss. It was an act of pure, unthinking maternal compassion, and it was a fatal mistake. The death of Princess Alice in 1878 was not an end, but a beginning. It was the moment her legacy, a complex inheritance of compassion, duty, sorrow, and a dangerous genetic secret, was passed into the hands of her 5 surviving children. While some would build upon her life of service and create stable, enduring dynasties, it was her youngest surviving daughter, the shy and melancholic Alex, who would carry that legacy to its most dramatic, tragic, and world-altering conclusion. Alex of Hesse, nicknamed Sunny in her happy childhood, grew into a young woman of intense feeling and deep, almost mystical piety. The traumas of her youth, the death of her brother, the loss of her mother and youngest sister, left her with a permanent sense of melancholy and a deep distrust of the frivolous, often cruel, world of court society. She found her one true anchor in the deep, abiding love of a young man who was destined to rule 1/6 of the world's landmass, Tsarevich Nicholas of Russia. Their marriage in 1894, shortly after the death of Nicholas's father, Tsar Alexander III, was a true love match. But it was also a collision of destinies. Alex, now Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna, was utterly ill-suited for her new role. She was painfully shy, which the Russian court mistook for arrogance and coldness. Her German heritage made her an object of suspicion, especially as tensions between Russia and Germany escalated in the years leading up to World War I. She retreated from the public eye, finding solace only within her immediate family and her fervent religious faith. The imperial couple had 4 beautiful daughters, but the pressure to produce a male heir was immense. Finally, in 1904, their prayers were answered. A son, Alexei, was born. The nation rejoiced, but within weeks that joy turned to absolute terror. After a minor accident, the baby began to bleed, and the bleeding would not stop. The doctors were helpless. The horrifying truth was revealed. Alexei had inherited hemophilia. The family curse of the British royals, the disease that had killed Alice's son Friedrich, had now emerged in the heir to the Russian throne. For Alexandra, this was a catastrophe on every level. It was a state secret that had to be hidden from the world, a source of constant, terrifying anxiety, and for her, a sign of God's displeasure. She believed she was being punished. Her desperation to save her son, the boy upon whose life the future of the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty rested, became the single, all-consuming obsession of her life. It was this desperation that opened the palace doors to one of the most infamous figures in history, the Siberian peasant mystic, Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin was a charismatic, debauched, and deeply controversial figure. But he possessed one quality that made him indispensable, for reasons that are still debated by historians. Perhaps a hypnotic ability to calm the boy, which lowered his blood pressure and slowed the bleeding. He seemed to be the only person who could ease Alexei's suffering. When the doctors had given up, a message to Rasputin would often coincide with the boy's recovery. For the frantic empress, this was nothing short of a miracle. She came to see him as a holy man, a saint sent by God to save her son. This belief gave Rasputin an unshakable hold over the empress, and through her, a powerful influence over the Tsar. While Nicholas was away at the front during World War I, Alexandra, relying on Rasputin's advice, interfered in government appointments, dismissing competent ministers and promoting his corrupt cronies. Vicious rumors, wildly exaggerated but eagerly believed by a public desperate for a scapegoat, spread like wildfire. Tales of a debauched affair between the Empress and the mad monk, of a German spy on the throne deliberately sabotaging the Russian war effort. The monarchy, already struggling under the immense weight of war and social unrest, was fatally discredited. The chain of events is as clear as it is tragic. Queen Victoria's spontaneous genetic mutation led to Princess Alice's unwitting inheritance. Alice passed the gene to her daughter Alex, whose maternal love and desperation, born from that inheritance, led her to Rasputin. Rasputin's influence then shattered the last vestiges of public trust in the throne, helping to create the conditions for revolution. In 1917, the storm finally broke. The Tsar was forced to abdicate. A year later, in a damp basement in the city of Ekaterinburg, the former Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, their 4 daughters, and the frail hemophiliac Tsarevich Alexei were brutally executed by a Bolshevik firing squad. Alice's compassionate heart had led to a daughter whose maternal desperation helped topple an empire. And as if to provide a final horrific postscript to the story, just 1 day later and hundreds of miles away, Alice's other Russian daughter, the beautiful Ella, Grand Duchess Elizabeth, who had become a devout nun after her husband's assassination, was also murdered by the Bolsheviks. She and several other Romanov relatives were thrown, still alive, down a disused mineshaft. The legacy of Princess Alice in Russia was not just ended, it was utterly and violently annihilated. In looking back at a life like Alice's, it's tempting to search for simple narratives, to cast blame, or to assign a single meaning to her legacy. The reality, of course, is far more complex. The most enduring debate surrounding her story revolves around that terrible genetic inheritance. To what extent was hemophilia responsible for the fall of the Romanovs? It would be far too simplistic to say that a single gene toppled a dynasty. The Russian Revolution was the product of centuries of social inequality, political oppression, and the catastrophic strain of a modern industrial war. The monarchy was already sitting on a powder keg. However, it is undeniable that the crisis of Alexei's hemophilia was the match that helped light the fuse. It created a vacuum of power and credibility at the very heart of the government, allowing a figure like Rasputin to flourish. It personalized the monarchy's decay, transforming political discontent into a tangible story of corruption and incompetence that everyone could understand. Hemophilia was not the cause of the revolution, but it was a powerful and tragic catalyst, accelerating the collapse and shaping the specific nature of the monarchy's downfall. Another, more subtle debate centers on Alice herself. Was she a true progressive, a proto-feminist social reformer who was genuinely ahead of her time? Or was she simply an exceptionally kind and dutiful aristocrat, working within the established confines of her class? The truth, as is so often the case, lies somewhere in the middle. She was undoubtedly a product of her time and station. She never questioned the existence of the monarchy or the class system. Yet her actions were revolutionary in their context. For a 19th century princess to correspond with Florence Nightingale, to establish professional training for women, and to roll up her own sleeves and nurse common soldiers in the filth of a field hospital was a radical departure from the norm. She redefined the role of a royal consort, moving it from a purely decorative function to one of active, engaged, and deeply personal service. So what, in the end, is the lasting significance of Princess Alice? Her story is a powerful, poignant lesson in the intricate and often invisible ways that private lives shape public history. Her legacy diverged into 2 starkly contrasting streams. In Russia and Prussia, her bloodline, brought tragedy and sorrow, a private genetic flaw that had devastating public consequences. But through her eldest daughter, Victoria, that same bloodline brought stability and continuity, creating a lineage of service that leads directly to the modern British royal family. Her life is a testament to the fact that a single individual can be a source of both immense creation and unwitting destruction. Culturally, her impact was profound. She helped to forge a new ideal of royal philanthropy, one that was not about distant, condescending charity, but about hands-on engagement and genuine empathy. She showed that a title could be a tool for profound social good, a model of compassionate leadership that has influenced generations of royals after her. But perhaps the most important lesson from her life is a deeply human one. It is a story about the immense strength that can be found in a gentle heart and the quiet dignity of a life lived for others. It reminds us that even within the most privileged of lives, no one is immune to pain, loss, and the cruel randomness of fate. She remains relevant today not just because she was a princess, but because her struggles are universal. The grief of a daughter, the fierce protective love of a mother, the search for purpose in a world of suffering. As we look back one last time on the life of Princess Alice of the United Kingdom, we see a portrait of profound and heartbreaking contradictions. She was an angel of mercy who could not save herself. She was a devoted mother whose own act of maternal love proved fatal. She was the carrier of a legacy that produced both the beloved grandmother of Prince Philip and the tragic last Empress of Russia. Her life was not a fairy tale. It was something far more real, more complex, and ultimately more meaningful. It was a testament to the fact that true strength is not the absence of suffering, but the courage to face it with compassion. Her story is a solemn reminder that history is not just a grand procession of kings and empires, of dates and battles. It is a vast, intricate web of human stories, of private sorrows that shape public destinies, of a mother's kiss, of a hidden gene, and of the enduring, fragile beauty of a life, however short, that is lived with love.